It's on. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here with us in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium for History is Lunch. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. I don't know if I have silenced my cell phone. For those willing to travel, there are excellent archaeological programs to our north and south tomorrow. At 7 p.m., the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians will hear University of Southern Mississippi anthropology professor Daniel Ledoux discussing evidence of 14 previously unknown prehistoric sites near Second Creek in Adams County. And then at Winterville Mounds, outside Greenville, there will be performances of traditional Native American dances and storytelling beginning at 6 p.m. Both events are free, and of course, October is Archaeology Month. In keeping with today's literary theme, I remind you that the second Saturday of the month falls on this weekend, so the Eudora Welty House and Garden will be open for tours that morning. If you haven't been there in a while, it should be lovely weather to visit. And then on Thursday of next week, the Old Capitol Museum will have their annual Present Meets Past Living History program from 5 to 7 p.m. Figures that will be portrayed include the legendary bluesman Buddy Waters, former MDH director Charlotte Capers, and former Governor Hiram Runnels. And of course, the museum's infamous dummy mummy is on display throughout October, always popular with the kids. Finally, I hope that you will join us next week for History's Lunch when William Sturkey will talk about his new book, Hattiesburg, An American City in Black and White. Today, we are delighted to have Richard Howorth and Lyn Roberts to discuss square books and Oxford's literary heritage. Here to say a few words about Lyn and Richard is their longtime friend and MDH Department Director, Katie Blunt.
Thank you. I don't usually get the microphone at History is Lunch, so I want to take the opportunity to thank Chris Goodwin for all he does to make this program one of the longest running and most popular programs in this department's history. And Chrissy Wilson hates it when I recognize her, but she started it, so thank you. And thank you all for coming week after week. I am so pleased to have the opportunity to introduce two dear old friends of mine, Richard Howorth and Lyn Roberts. Lyn is a native of Gulfport, and in 1988, she was a law student at the University of Mississippi and began working at Square Books. She's now the store's chief executive officer. Richard was born in Marks to a family with longtime ties to Oxford. He served twice as Oxford's mayor. He's former president of the American Booksellers Association. He received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Authors Guild in 2008, and last week was inducted into the University of Mississippi Alumni Hall of Fame. Together with Richard's wife, Lisa, Richard and Lyn have built one of the best bookstores in the country, if not the world. They've earned a national reputation, and they've drawn thousands of writers to Mississippi over the years. Square Books, Off Square, Square Books Junior, and now Rare Square have greatly enriched the cultural life of this state. Also my life. 30 years ago, I met my husband David at Square Books where he was working at the time. Please welcome Richard Howorth and Lyn Roberts.
Does this work? This works. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Katie and Chris. Thank all of you for coming out today. I hope we can do something entertaining. I haven't seen these pictures, I don't think, so I'm not sure what y'all are looking at, but maybe later on you can ask whatever questions you have about that. Just as in terms of pre-Square Books literary Oxford, I suppose the first literary figure was A.B. Longstreet, who was the chancellor of the university from 1849 to 56. He had written Georgia Scenes in 1935, but I don't think wrote anything after that. He was always supposed to write a follow-up book to that, but I don't think he ever got around to it. Stark Young was an Oxford figure who was born about 15 years before Faulkner was born, and he was born in Como, and his family moved to Oxford when I think he was about 10 or 12 or something like that. He went to the University of Texas. He came back. He taught at the University of Mississippi for a while, and I think he was 21 when his first book was published. It was a book of poetry, and he wrote a bestseller in 1934 called So Red the Rose. His chief field was drama. He wrote plays, but he really became sort of the preeminent theater critic in New York, writing mostly for The Atlantic in about a 3-decade period, the 20s, 30s, 40s. And he also, this is my favorite Stark Young fact, he translated Chekhov in what is today still the standard translation of Chekhov's plays. He did not know a word of Russian. He knew Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, and he just got a Russian-English dictionary, and with his knowledge of stagecraft and theater, gave a translation that has held up all these years. He also helped Faulkner out a bit when Faulkner was first starting to want to write and to chiefly get out of Oxford. Stark Young was living in New York. Families got in touch. Stark Young got him to come up and got him a job in a bookstore at a Doubleday bookshop that was managed by Elizabeth Prawl. And he only lasted about 3 weeks because his mother got nervous. I think he was 19 years old at the time. So he came back home, and after he had left, Elizabeth Prawl met Sherwood Anderson, and shortly after that became his fourth wife. And she moved to New Orleans, and it was because Faulkner knew that she was in New Orleans and married to Sherwood Anderson that he went down there, and that's when he really first began to write and get published, at least in Contempo and papers and little bits of publication. Faulkner had been influenced by Phil Stone, a lawyer in Oxford who was educated at Yale and majored in the classics. He had a large personal library and introduced Strindberg and others. I can't remember exactly who, but Faulkner, he deepened Faulkner's reading when Faulkner was still quite young. When I was growing up in Oxford, there was, of course, the University Bookstore, and the only other bookstore was Rebel Press, which was chiefly an office supply store. But they had one room that had no windows in it that was probably about 10 by 10 room, and it was covered with nothing but modern library editions. So they had every modern library edition that there was, which is a pretty good reading list. When I was in school at the University of Mississippi, the University Bookstore, the only books they had that were not required reading was a spinner rack of paperbacks, and on that rack of books, I saw this book called The Moviegoer. I had not heard of it, but the cover appealed to me, and the idea of a character who was a moviegoer appealed to me, and I read that, and that was sort of a life changer for me. My oldest brother was always inventing ideas for us. For the rest of us, I have four brothers, and I think he probably recognized that I was aimless at an early age, and he was always suggesting things that I could do. And one of those things was to open a bookstore. So it had long been in the back of my mind. a couple in Oxford opened the Critics' Corner, I'm going to say in about 1971 or two. It didn't last very long. I think it was just too small, and the couple, I think the couple broke up. The marriage broke up. At any rate, they were there for a couple of years, and closed. And Lisa and I married. We were trying to put our lives together. I was trying to get her to finish school. Held down a couple of different jobs, and then she got accepted to graduate school in Chapel Hill. We went up there for a year, and it was while we were there that we decided that we really were going to give this opening a bookstore a try. Went to Washington, D.C., worked at an old bookstore there called the Saville Bookshop, and learned enough there to come back and open Square Books in September of 1979. There had been, prior to opening the bookstore, the Faulkner Conference started in 1973, which attracted a lot of readers, obviously, and scholars and writers. The Center for the Study of Southern Culture began to get started in the mid-1970s. I think that was chiefly a matter of Ann Abity spending several years writing grants to get the funds to open that. And one of the more fortuitous things that happened to Square Books was Bill Ferris was hired to be the first full-time director of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, and he came to Oxford in the summer of 1979, which was the same summer that Lisa and I came home to open the bookstore. If you know Bill, you know that he's a very charismatic, enthusiastic person. He has these bright blue eyes. He's very bright and personable. And the first couple of times I met him, and he was saying, "Richard, this bookstore is going to be great. I know so and so and so and so, and we're going to bring them to your bookstore. This is going to be great, and the center's getting started." And he had so much enthusiasm, and I thought he was blowing a little bit of smoke. I wasn't sure at first. But I had seen him in Washington. The first time I met him was in Washington, and he came to give a talk to raise money. He was then working for the Center for Southern Folklore in Memphis, and he showed that film, Hush Hoggies Hush, which is about a 4-minute film about a man an old farmer who's taught his pigs to pray, and lasts about 4 minutes, and that was one of the greatest things I'd ever seen. Anyway, Bill was true to his word. Willie Morris was the other fortuitous ingredient in the bookstore's life. He came to Oxford in the spring of 1980. I think he was kind of done in New York. He was looking for a change. He was offered a writer-in-residence position at the University of Mississippi, and he's the only true writer-in-residence I've ever known. The university didn't give him a job, didn't give him any classes, but they let him live in a house for free. And he lived in one of those faculty houses close to the university behind the law school, which are no longer there, and stayed in Oxford for 10 years. And indeed, he was enthusiastic like Bill Ferris was. He says, "I'm going to bring you, all my buddies are going to come down here and do book signings." William Styron came in 1981. John Knowles, who wrote a separate piece, came in those early years. Gene Stein, who'd written this biography of Edie Sedgwick and had met Faulkner when she was in Paris as a student at the Sorbonne. I think she was in her early 20s and he was in his 50s. And they had an affair. She was interested in coming to Square Books and did, but we didn't do a scheduled signing. Willie called on a Sunday morning and asked me if I could come open up the store. It was cold. I had a feeling they hadn't gone to sleep yet. They came up and she was wearing a mink coat, high heel shoes, and as far as I could tell, that was all. I couldn't really tell anything else, but maybe that was just my imagination going. Will Campbell came early, Beverly Lowry came early. The other great fortune to Square Books or any bookstore that's in Mississippi is that we have the by far highest number of great writers per capita than any state in the nation, and we may have more great writers as a raw number. I think nobody's really even close. So many of those people who had connections to Mississippi or connections to Willie or connections to Bill Ferris came in those early years. In those days, the whole book tour thing for writers was not what it is today. Publishers didn't routinely send writers out to bookstores. They would send them into major media markets to be on television, radio, and that sort of thing, but not just to do book signings. The Oxford scene then, the Hoka had opened, a great art house movie theater in Oxford. The Gin, which was a bar, a large bar that it was in an old cotton gin, had opened by that time, and there was sort of along with Square Books, a little cultural change in Oxford that I think was a little bit exciting. Toni Morrison came due to a connection to Bill. Alex Haley, same thing. In those early years, the first person to do a book signing at Square Books was Ellen Douglas. She had been a classmate of my mother's at Ole Miss, and she agreed to do that as long as you order enough books, she told me. I ordered 50 books and we sold 49, and I was so hoping that we did not sell that last book so that she wouldn't accuse me of not ordering enough. But and then Barry Hannah moved to Oxford in 1982, and that was, he was kind of a perfect companion to Willie Morris, Willie the nonfiction writer, the journalist, and Barry the sort of hip cat fiction writer. Some of the other people's, we stayed in that location. We opened in an upstairs because it was the only place I could find on the square, and we stayed in that location until 1986. Margaret Walker Alexander, Tom McGuane, Gretel Ehrlich came. She was the first writer, I think, that didn't know somebody, or we didn't know. She had heard about us and wanted to come there. And then we moved the store to where it is today. The main store is today in 1986, and things began to pick up. Allen Ginsberg came to town and stayed for almost a week and gave a book signing and reading. His book signing lasted 5.5 hours, and it wasn't because it was such a long line. There were a lot of people, but each person who came to get a book signed, he would have you sit down. He was sitting at the table. He would ask you, who are you? Where are you from? What are you interested in? So he got to know every single person that he signed a book for, which was quite remarkable. Archibald Cox, the Watergate prosecutor, came in those early days. Where is he now? Ernest Gaines, William Eggleston, Tobias Wolff, Peter Goralnik, and then four signings in this period stand out in my mind. In 1986, Richard Ford came to sign The Sports Writer. That was the beginning of a long relationship with him, and friendship for that matter. Allen Ginsberg, I mentioned, came in 87. In 1988, Larry Brown's first book, Facing the Music, was published, and that was big times. And then less than a year later, in 1989, John Grisham's first book came out, A Time to Kill, and he did his first book signing at Square Books. Other writers began to come, Robert Stone, Ann Patchett, Gloria Steinem, George Plimpton, who would come actually several times, Bobby Ann Mason, Elizabeth Spencer. And one of the lucky things that happened with us was that we kind of got to know Seymour Lawrence. He was a publisher. He's no longer alive. He was a publisher who had published. He began working in 1952, and he developed his own imprint in 1965. He had published J.P. Donlevy, who was another writer that I read when I was very young and loved, and also Kurt Vonnegut, whose Slaughterhouse-Five had been rejected by 70 publishers. And actually, he had a contract with one, and that publisher broke the contract, and Seymour Lawrence picked him up. And another thing he did that was very clever was he made himself not only their publisher, but said, look, if you just let me be your agent too, we'll both save a lot of money. And both Brautigan and Vonnegut agreed to that. And so I think he maybe got 5%, but 5% of everything that Vonnegut and Brautigan were doing in the 1960s and 70s was good money. He published Catherine Ann Porter, Joseph Heller, Jim Harrison, Tom McGuane, Jane Ann Phillips, Tim O'Brien, Richard Bausch, Gus Jun, Frank Conroy, four Nobelists, at least in English, Jorge Seferis, Camilo Jose Cela, Miguel Asturias, and Pablo Neruda. And Seymour was also a big fan of Lemuria. Lemuria had done such a good job with Jim Harrison and making an early connection with Jim, who was one of Lawrence's most prolific writers. And so Seymour Lawrence began to send all of these writers that I've just mentioned, not the Nobel Prize winners, but the Americans at any rate, he sent to our store and to Lemuria with just about every book. He also liked Oxford a lot. He had become a companion to Joan Williams, the writer who also, as a 23-year-old, I believe, knew William Faulkner. And they were together, they lived together, and bought a house in Oxford. So he had a presence here in Mississippi. The Faulkner Conference had started in 1973. I mentioned that. In the center, I mentioned that. And now that we're at least in 1988 when Lynn Roberts came around, I'm going to turn it to Lynn.
Okay, y'all can hear me. Sorry, I think my ears are too floppy for this thing. 1988 and so Larry Brown had published Facing the Music, and Barry Hannah was around, and John Grisham had first published Time to Kill. So it was a pretty fun time. So it was a great time to start working at Square Books. So fun that once I finished law school, I didn't want to practice law. I thought selling books was a lot more fun. So maybe not as lucrative, but I've pretty much been able to eat. So Grisham, of course, published Time to Kill in 1989, and it was not self-published, but it was a teeny-weeny publisher. And Richard read it, and although there are always authors coming up saying, please read my book that I've written, and you just try to sidestep that a lot. And Richard read it and liked it, and so he offered to do a book signing, and then in 1991, The Firm was published, and The Firm was huge, of course, and actually became went to Hollywood and started making the rounds of all the producers. So before that book was even published, there was such a huge buzz about it. And John moved to Oxford from South Haven, and sort of became life as a full-time writer. He was just so immediately successful, and was such a nice guy that his first book signing for the firm, the signing just went down the block, and then people would leave their books for him at the store to sign, and he would come by all the time, sign books at the end of the counter. Eventually, he bought a building in Oxford, which was an old historic church, and in Freedmanstown called the Belfry, and he opened an office there. And he had, in this huge room, he had all these tables set up, and people would drop off their books, and he would sign them, and then, they could come back to the store or to the Belfry. And so he had this, it was practically a factory, and we would take books to him all the time and get him to sign all of these books. So he was always really generous about that. And maybe he had to, that's maybe why he moved away from Oxford, to get away from signing all those books all the time. But he was great, and actually has always been very kind to the bookstores. That there are only a handful of them, Lemuria and Reed's and Burke's in Memphis, that hosted book signings for him. And so he's always remembered those stores, no matter that he's now, superstar, and continued to provide signed books for us, and that's a great help. So that was going on. That was pretty good times, and then in 1993, the Oxford Conference for the Book started, and this is something that Richard and Ann Abity put together, and it was meant to be a conference just for book lovers and about the book, not an academic conference. There would be no serious papers read. It was just going to be people talking about books and about their books and other people's books. And so that started in 1993, and that brought a lot of people in. Stephen King, John Grisham brought Stephen King in. So it was really, from the start, it was a great, lots of superstars. And that has continued to this day, and it's every spring, and we continue to have partner with the Oxford Conference for the Book to help them bring authors from all over the world in for that. In 1997, well, I should backtrack a little bit. So Richard moved Square Books into its current location, which was an old drugstore, in 1986, from the second floor that he had. And then in 1992, a building came up for lease down the street, which is an old furniture store. And it was a huge cavern, lime green paint kind of peeling. The air conditioner didn't really work. But it had this great neon out front, and he thought, this is a great spot for a used bargain bookstore. And it was, but it was also this very cavernous space. And it operated for not too long before the musicians in town realized that, hey, this is a really good spot. So there were some graduate students who were at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, and they saw this space, and they wanted to have an old-time radio show. And so they approached Richard, and he said, well, sure, I'd be happy for y'all to do that, but it has to have something to do with books. So that's how Thacker Mountain Radio was born and started. The first few years were sort of crazy. The graduate students stuck around, and they were the Ramblers. And but as they moved on and continued their career and left, the Square Books was more and more responsible for running the show. And we had belly dancers on. We had a hot dog eating contest. All this on the radio. So we were very, we would try anything. Over the years, it is now, some years ago, it finally became a nonprofit, thank goodness. And so they have like a real executive producer, no longer me and Richard, so it's well run now. And as some of you know, it is broadcast live in Oxford and then again on Mississippi Public Radio on Saturday night. And we try to feature international authors and artists, musicians, but also focus a lot on our Mississippi arts, our musicians and authors too. So that's one thing is Richard's always never been afraid to try something new and has always been looking for new avenues, like with the book conference and Thacker Mountain Radio, and then also led him to become mayor of Oxford for like 8 years, and he was the president of the American Booksellers Association, and so has always been interested in this idea of the bookstore as a part of the community and community service being a big component of the store. Yes, I'm not working this very linearly. I'm jumped back to 2002 as part of the community. The University of Mississippi, of course, is in Oxford. Oxford is a small town, and without the university, it would not be the place it is now, because it is a very supportive community for reading and books. And part of that is that the university established the MFA program in 2002. Barry Hannah, of course, was very instrumental in that and taught. It's sort of a great influence for a lot of young writers. Now, those writers are really starting to sort of get out of there. Jimmy Kajolius, who's from Jackson, has just published, I think, his 4th middle grade book. He does YA and middle grade books. He was a graduate of the program, and Emma Walsh, Michael Bible, Bill Boyle. So in that partnership with the university, we were able to have a lot of writers come through who were speaking at the university. And also, it's kind of exciting to see graduate students who now have grown up, so to speak, and then come back to the store to do their signings, and so many staff people from the store over the years. John T. Edge, who's the head of the Southern Foodways Association, used to work at the bookstore years ago, and Michael Bible was worked at the store. Not really very well, but he's turned out to be a good writer. To be a good writer doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good bookseller. So Square Books moved to that building in 1986. Off Square Books opened in 1992 at this other location, but then But the original idea had been to have a children's bookstore. So finally, in 2003, the first floor below where Square Books originally started on the second floor became available, and so we opened Square Books Junior. That was so much fun because that was during the big, huge Harry Potter years where there were new releases. So what we did is, and many stores would begin selling the Harry Potter books at midnight. But, I guess maybe a little prudish of us, but we thought that children shouldn't be up at midnight. So we would open the store like at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. and tell people to come in their pajamas, and people would. So that morning there'd been paper in front of the new Square Books Junior building, and so no one really knew what was going on. We kept it really secret. And then that morning we blocked off the front door of Square Books, and had by the order of Ministry of Magic, and then sort of sent people around the square on a scavenger hunt, and then everyone finally ended up at Square Books Junior, which was great fun to see people running in their pajamas all around the town, and then opening the kids store. And from the beginning, it is it's so much fun to go over there. It's completely chaotic and loud, but the kids really feel like that it's their store and it's their place. And we hope that will carry on in the future, that will inspire them to continue reading and to feel at home in a bookstore, and not feel like it's only a place for intellectuals or that there's anything snobby about it. Then in 2005, another place became available, and Richard was able to get that on the square and move off Square Books, which had been a lease space, and same sort of space, big, long, cavernous. The Thacker Mountain Radio moved there, but we did get a good air conditioner, and it was painted too, so it was no longer that lime green color. And that has been the event space since then, where we host about 150, 160 events a year. So I think Katie said that earlier, that there have probably been about somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 authors who have come and signed at Square Books over the years. Orhan Pamuk, who's a Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Woodrell, Donald Harrington, Marilyn Robinson, Martin Amis, James Dickey, Ha Jin, Frank McCourt. This is, it goes on and on, but lots of National Book Award winners, Pulitzer Prize, George Saunders and Adam Johnson, Jay McInerney, Michael Ondaatje, poets, Sharon Old, Yusef Kumanyaka, Louise Gluck, of course, Natasha Trethewey, who is a Mississippian, and Sterling Plump, also a Mississippian. We've had fantastic children's authors, Kevin Hinkes, Mo Willems, Gloria Pinckney, Mildred Taylor, Chris Van Allsburg. We're going to have Jason Reynolds coming up this Friday, just to put a little plug in for us. And then many nonfiction writers, too. We've had the fortune of David Ashinsky, who wrote the book about Parchman, Jessica Mitford, Tony Horowitz, wrote Confederates in the Attic, who tragically died earlier this year, Michael Lewis, and James Meredith, too, in 2012 when he published Mission from God. And that sort of really brings us up to the 40th anniversary that we've had just celebrated recently. The actual date is September 14th, but we had a great party, and as part of the celebration, Richard was able to move back into the original store on the second floor and open Rare Square Books, which is a collectible store. As he says, many of the books are just really kind of medium rare. But we tossed around so many names for that store to try to describe it, and things like antiquarian books and all sorts of silly things. But so we have. So now, Square Books is, doesn't roll off my tongue quite yet, but it's 4 stores and 3 buildings on 5 floors on the historic square in Oxford, Mississippi. So it's wonderful to see you all, and I'm honored that you want to hear about Square Books and Oxford and our literary history. And I'm going to turn it back over to Richard Howorth.
Stay up there. Stay up if you will.
Stay up?
Yeah, I'm just kind of signing off and
Okay, I'll
going to
just
open it up for questions. I said when we first opened the store there wasn't really a writer at all living in Oxford, and today Tom Franklin, Beth Ann Finley, Melissa Ginsberg, Mary Miller, Kiese Laymon, Lee Durkee, John T. Edge, Wright Thompson, Michael Ferris Smith, Ace Atkins, William Boyle, Derek Harrell, and lest I forget, Lisa Howorth, which is, enriched the community in all kinds of ways. It's just been a great trip. We've had the occasional odd ducks that write books. A couple of vice presidents, Joe Biden, Al Gore, sports people, Tony La Russa, Archie Manning, Carl Perkins, John Darnielle. And we've made friends with some of these people. That's one of the great benefits of what we've done. And probably the most meaningful events of all the authors we've had at least 3 Holocaust survivors who've written memoirs, Marion Lazan, Lucien Duckstein, and Arno Lustig. And every time those were meaningful visits and meaningful with all the people who read those books and came into contact with those writers. And so I just kind of wanted to close on that thankful note and open it up for questions.
Where can we buy your autobiography?
That'd be in outer space somewhere.
okay. Do we need to use the
Yeah, if
the
you'll raise your hand, we'll
microphone?
bring the microphone to you. Question?
Who's the most popular writer we've ever had there?
John Grisham. But as Lynn mentioned, Stephen King has been there. We've had Michael Connelly is a popular mystery writer. I mentioned Alice Walker.
David Sedaris.
David Sedaris, who was a riot, actually. I don't know. Yeah.
This was my fear, that people were going to
Yes,
ask
of
about
course.
authors.
Yeah.
Everything was going to go right
Well,
out of my head.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Quick question. I'm just wondering. I know you have mentioned some black authors like Toni Morrison and James Meredith and those, and there are others that I guess you have mentioned. I was wondering if your business, did it engage in any kind of segregation before the 1960s? Because I know, you could say segregation was started to change during the 1960s with Meredith and people like Meredith who were going to try to introduce blacks into certain areas and certain institutions, certain organizations. I'm wondering if your bookstore exercised any kind of segregation before the 1960s.
Our bookstore only opened in 1979, so that's post desegregation. Not to say that segregation ever completely gets behind us, but from the beginning, I I think that I mentioned Etheridge Knight. The second person who ever signed books at our store was Etheridge Knight, African-American poet from Corinth, Mississippi, who taught himself to write while he was serving 20 years time in the Indiana State Penitentiary. He was a lovely man, a lovely poet. And we've, in terms of the staffing of our store and the writers that we have come there, whether they're children's authors or adult writers or nonfictions or poets or whatever, I think we have, I like to think that we have our fair share or more than our fair share of representation of the African American population in Mississippi or anywhere else. But no. Yes, sir.
I don't have a question, but maybe there's a question. Is it true that John Grisham essentially donated his office to the community for the establishment of a museum?
He did.
Yes, it's the Belfry, and it's really as much of an event space as a museum. It's there. I think that it's ongoing fundraising for that.
Right.
If anybody wants to send them a check.
He's been generous in many ways to the community. He endowed the visiting writer position in the fine arts program, Master Fine Arts program in writing at the university. He did all kinds of things for Little League and I can't remember what all, but he's been extremely generous to the Oxford community and to communities at large. I just started reading his next book last night. I just got it yesterday, and it has to do with the death penalty and what a horrible and wrong thing that is. I think is going to be the gist of that book. I'm pretty sure that's going to be the gist of that book.
Yes. Today, the New York Times published the five finalists for different categories, children's book, fiction, nonfiction. How do you try to capitalize on that?
Well, for one thing, at least one of those writers, Sarah Broom, two of those
Julia Pierpont.
Julia Pierpont.
She made the short list.
Short list, and Sarah Broom was on the long list.
No, Sarah Broom is nonfiction.
Nonfiction on the short list.
The Yellow House.
The Yellow House. She is an African-American writer who came to visit us just about a month ago. Julia Phillips has already been there. What we want to be able to do is actually sort of predict almost what those books will be and try to have those books that might be winners before they're announced as winners. Usually once they're announced, they're very much in demand elsewhere and they're through doing the tour for the book because they usually do that when the books just come out. Though I imagine a lot of them will go back out on tour, but they'll probably go they'll probably be paid at universities or other places to go, and of course we don't pay. We depend on the publisher to send them to us, and that's how it works.
And we don't charge for events either. We do have about 150 events, and they're always free. And yes, and anyone can come, and you don't have to buy a book. Though we'd like you to, but so we're always looking for writers and books that are good, and so we try to get nonfiction, fiction, just every type of book that anybody would like that speak to as many audiences as we think would be interested in our community.
But a lot of that depends on our relationship with the publishers. And one of the things that we started doing in 1992, we announced that we would have a signed book club and that people could sign up and agree to buy one book a month. We would send one, just like a Book of the Month club, except it would be a signed first edition. and they had the option to return maybe 2 books or 3 books or something like that. And that built over the years. It got to be more than 200 people. And so when we're able to tell the publisher we're choosing that for our book club, that's an automatic 200 book sale, then that helps sometimes.
Richard,
Yeah.
Um,
Yes. Hey, Jimmy.
this may not be fair because it's too recent, but you mentioned the relationship of the bookstore and the university. A number of people in Oxford, I'm sure you're aware of this, are kind of reeling with and trying to figure out how to digest and what to do about the announcement of the IHL board for the new chancellor for the university. And many of us, and I include myself in this group, are very much afraid that there's going to be an effort to turn back the clock on how the university will be operated and perceived. And it occurs to me that bookstores have a great power and tool that might enable us to address better some of the concerns that many of us have. I've wondered, this is very fresh, and the new chancellor obviously deserves a chance, but I'd like to, if you feel free to give us any comments you might have about what the bookstore might do to help out the poor university.
Why don't you just open that with, Richard, I'd like to put you on the spot. Okay. Lynn told me on the way down here that the new chancellor was in the bookstore yesterday. And she said that many people, when she said that or found out about that, asked, what did he buy? And she said, I told them what we always say, we don't tell other people what books our customers buy. That's just, we don't divulge that. But of course she told me. And but anyway, I was glad to hear that he was in the bookstore. Andy Mullins was with him. I think Andy was showing him around. And I don't know, I'm unable to make the connection of exactly how the bookstore can be an agent of any kind in this matter. I think everyone agrees that the process was foul. I won't say any. I think they miffed that, obviously, and I would hope even they admit that. But it is what it is. They did what they did. People argue that if you get down in that particular ditch, it's only going to end up harming the university itself. And I think there's a little bit of wisdom about that. So it's a kind of a crisis, I think, and I think there are enough people the university is strong enough, and the people who teach there and go to school there are strong enough to overcome it in whatever way that is. I'm not sure.
Can I make a broader point?
Yes.
One thing about the bookstore is that we want to serve everyone, and we want everyone to be able to get the books and read the books they want. And so, the First Amendment is very important, and we don't turn people away. And some years ago, when House Bill 1523, whatever it was,
Yes.
Richard wrote this thing called "All Are Welcome Here," and it's a broadside. It says, everybody is welcome here. We don't care, what color you are, what color your hair is, how you wear your pants, and all these things. But basically, the idea is that the best way the bookstore can serve the community is by making it a comfortable place for everyone to go, and hopefully that will allow people to educate, enlighten themselves, and then they will do the right thing. So there's no, the store doesn't really have agenda other than getting people to read.
And we want to buy the book. We want to stock the books that our customers want. It's not, and so there are many books by all kinds of people that politically I don't agree with, for instance. But we buy those books and we display those books. And if our customers want those books, then we should, enable that. We don't make a determination. Lynn mentioned the First Amendment, and that's sort of the golden rule for us.
Could you tell me a little bit about Will Campbell? He's from down my home county and hometown, and I think he was a character.
He was a character. He was a minister who, a Baptist minister who was very Christian, and to the core, and to the extent that he loved the Klansmen as much as he loved his African American neighbor. And that was a real hard thing to hear and for a lot of us to understand and believe, and kind of still is. But he was just an incredible force, and he was a strong ACLU advocate and outspoken, and his book, A Brother to a Dragonfly, is one of my favorite books ever. Just a great, great book.
I am a reader, the old-fashioned kind that likes to go to the store and pull the book off the shelf. I like to look at shelves of books and see something new. B. Dalton, Walden Books, Borders have closed. Barnes & Noble is in trouble. How are you, as an independent bookstore in Mississippi, surviving as well as you seem to be doing?
Well, we hadn't showed you our numbers today. But I don't know. It's complicated. I mean, just for us, we're closely connected to our community. People, I think, value us and support us for that reason. Not everybody, of course. I know that some people go on the internet and buy from internet sources and that sort of thing, and but I can't really control that. We have, as we've said, lots of events. We have lots of activities. We have a very strong emphasis on developing children as readers, and all those kinds of things that we do, I hope, translate to the general population that we are valuable to the community and valuable enough for them to go ahead and get out in their car and come pay to park on the square now, and come in and buy a book. It's hard. And Borders and Barnes and Nobles. I mean, the chains have always kind of, they've morphed and come and gone, and that's not true just in the internet era. That was true before, and I think there's something about corporate giantism and the very complex business of running a bookstore and selling books that doesn't lend itself well to corporate selling, unless you've mastered the internet and got the reason Jeff Bezos started with books is because books have an ISBN, an International Standard Book Number, and every single product is perfectly identifiable by what used to be a 10, now a 13-digit number. That's why he started with books. That's a long story.
Time for one last question.
Okay, you mentioned your rare books, and not necessarily rare, but those that are older and less common. It's a long way to Oxford. Do you have a list, a mailing list, a website, or anything that lists any of those titles? Because if I want to know the books that I'm interested in are there before I drive that far.
Right. Give us a little more time. I'm serious, because we've just got that thing open, and collectible books and used books are more problematic than new books because everyone is different. They're in different condition. They have to be described perfectly, whether they have a dust jacket, whether somebody cut the price off, whether it's got somebody's name in the book, what condition it's in. Make sure whether it's a first edition or, later printing and all that sort of stuff. So it's the inventory management is more time consuming, and we really are just kind of getting started. And we don't have anything on the internet yet. I'm sure at some point we will. I'm guessing we will. I'm sure we will. Lynn will make me if we don't. And we'll probably do it that way. Whether we'll issue a catalog, we'll probably issue paper catalogs of certain collections or certain kinds of books. But so give us your address before you go, and when we have something, I'll send it to you. Okay.
Thank you all for coming today. We've reached the top of another hour, but I'm sure Lynn and Richard will be glad to answer any questions you may have afterwards. I hope that we see you back here next Wednesday. Help me thank Lynn Roberts and Richard Howorth for this program today.